Yeah, so keep the mic in nice and close. Okay, well, welcome back to an episode of MLST Gogglebox, the Munk Debate Special Edition. And I'm here with my good friend, David Foster. David, introduce yourself.
Yeah, great to be back again, Tim. Thanks for having me on. I'm David Foster. I'm co-founder of a company called Applied Data Science Partners. We're an AI consultancy here based in London. I'm also the author of a book called Generative Deep Learning, which came out, first of all, in 2019, and the second edition has just been published about a month ago. I'm obviously really excited to see the applications of generative AI, both commercially, but also, to see how it's now driving the debate around things like artificial general intelligence and existential risk. Really excited to see the Munk debate the other day come out, because I think, a lot of the technologies they're talking about there are ultimately generative AI. That's what sparked all of this new excitement about the field.
Now, we're going to actually watch the Munk debate with you, and we're going to give you a rolling commentary. But just before we do that, first of all, David, you've got a podcast that you've just launched as well. Do you want to just plug that?
Yeah, sure. It's called the AI Canvas, and it's basically a podcast where we talk to people who are going to be impacted by things like generative AI, but don't necessarily have a background in the field. Because I think a missing part of the conversation actually these days is speaking to people who are kind of aware that this technology is here and it's in the public eye, obviously, a lot these days, but aren't necessarily the ones who are going to be building the models, but are going to be using them. So we're talking to teachers, we're talking to lawyers, we're talking to people in education sector, we're talking to people in marketing, just people who are like seriously worried, like photographers, anybody who is thinking to themselves, maybe I should actually pay attention to this technology. And we just have a very open and honest discussion about what it's capable of doing, what it's not capable of doing. And so hopefully people can find interest in this, because it's a different angle that they might not hear about through other means. So yeah, that's what it's called, AI Canvas.
Amazing. Okay, so this Munk debate, it's been shared everywhere on Twitter, and it had Jan LeCun and Melanie Mitchell. Melanie's my favorite person in the whole world on the con side, and on the pro side was Max Tegmark and my mind's blanking.
Joshua Benjo.
And Joshua Benjo. Yeah, sorry, Joshua. So, high-level thoughts before we roll into it.
Right, so high-level thoughts. I really enjoyed the debate. I thought it's obviously a debate that needs to happen. There's obviously a real split in the community at the moment. So to get such prominent figures talking about this openly and having a very honest and frank debate is certainly what's needed. I think if I were to sort of briefly summarize both positions, I would say the X-risk side often comes at this from a perspective of exponential growth and the fact that we've developed technologies all through our existence that have in some way been able to cause harm, but the idea that this technology might be the one that actually tips over the edge to existential risk. So that's certainly Max Tegmark's opinion. And then on the other side, you have people like LeCun and Melanie Mitchell saying, well, first of all, there's not actually a guarantee that any of this that we're building is, first of all, an existential risk. We need to go far more into the detail, and there's missing parts, in the words of Jan LeCun. But also to say, we also need to kind of have this very open discussion about what exactly we mean by intelligence and smartness. We hear words like super intelligence, or it's going to be smarter than us, really used quite broadly and in a way that kind of doesn't actually offer much, I think, to the debate, because surely a definition of these terms is essential if we're going to be actually talking about these as potentially causing us harm. We need to understand why and what the mechanism is, what's the specifics of the situation that does so. So I thought whilst the debate was good, and we heard certainly the broad brushstrokes from both sides, I think it could have also gone into detail, but maybe that's what we can do today in this discussion.
Yeah, completely agree. So we'll talk about the mechanism point in detail later, but as you say, with every other existential threat, the why, the mechanism is laid out clearly, it's understood, it's known, whereas in this particular example, it's not known, and when you try and press them on the mechanism, like what is intelligence, they're not having any of it. So we'll talk about that as we go through. So in which case, we're going to press the play button, and Gogglebox will continue.
Technology can be used for good and for bad, and its power is growing exponentially, which means, of course, that its blast radius, the amount of damage it can do to our society is also growing exponentially. Back in the Stone Age with a rock, maybe someone could kill 5 people. 300 years ago with a bomb, maybe 100 people. In 1945 with a couple nukes, 250,000 people. With bioweapons, even more. With nuclear winter, according to a recent Science article, over 5 billion people. So now the blast radius has risen up to about 60% of humanity. And since, as we'll argue, superhuman intelligence is going to be way more powerful than any of this, its blast radius can easily be 100% of humanity, giving it the potential power to really wipe us out. Now, to stir things up, I have a tweet here from my friend John LeCun who says that making AI safe is going to happen, as with every new tech, and it's going to be a process of iterative refinement. Now, I think iterative refinement is great for less powerful technology like jet engines and less powerful AI, where you have the luxury of trying many times. But I think it's a terrible strategy when you're talking about things as powerful as nuclear winter or some future AI that we could completely lose control over, because then you really only get one chance. You have to get it right the first time and can't come back and iteratively refine. Now, why is it that superhuman AI can be so much more powerful than all those other technologies? It's because, by definition, it can do all the intelligent things that we humans can do, just better. For example, it can do goal-oriented behavior, it can persuade, manipulate, hire people, start companies, build robots, do scientific research. It could, for example, research how to make more powerful bioweapons, or how to make even more intelligent systems so it could recursively self-improve itself. It also could do things that we humans cannot do at all. It could very easily make copies of itself. So if you imagine for a moment a superhuman AI that can think.
I feel like we need to press pause here before I forget half of the points that he's made. So he's talking about iterative improvement does not work for dangerous technology. He asserted that this technology can already do science. I don't think it can. And he asserted that recursive self-improvement is a problem. And he asserted that this technology has a blast radius that's greater than the world we live on. So let's touch on some of those.
Yeah, so I think firstly, if you look at that chart, I think there's actually a case to be said here around comparing apples with oranges, because if you look at the early things that he's putting up there, things like rocks, bombs, nukes, bioweapons, these all have physical impact in the world. The entity themselves is the thing that's causing the damage. To then, write AGI as the last point, AGI in itself is more akin to human. It's like you draw this chart and then at the last point you put human. And it's like the human itself is just something that has the potential to use these other technologies. So I think it's firstly a fallacy to draw a chart where the final point on this curve of things that cause physical harm in the world is AGI, because AGI itself isn't the risk. What he's trying to say is that it has the potential to use other technologies that do create physical harm in the world. So I think, first of all, there's something to be said here around, there's a missing gap between, saying AGI has the potential to use all of these physically harmful technologies, or is he saying that the entity itself is something that we should fear in its own right, because it has the potential to be embodied and actually go around actually causing physical harm itself. So I think that's the first point to note that I think is worth mentioning.
Just before we move on to the second point, I think we should touch on this substrate thing. So in a sense, we are increasingly living in the informational substrate anyway. And philosophers have said that's our main nature of existence. There's a digital divide. Our children live almost entirely in the digital substrate. And therefore, if there was a nuclear bomb in the digital substrate, that would actually cause harm, potentially, or not, depending on how you look at it. But what do you think about that kind of gap in where we live?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's always going to be technologies that cause so-called explosions in the digital substrate. I mean, you could say the same thing about computers themselves, or the very fact the internet came along was an absolute explosion of how we interact digitally. So I think just to say, another technology that is able to do things in the digital substrate that we currently can't imagine is an existential threat, is a huge leap to make. And I would still argue that for something to really be talked about seriously as an existential threat, it needs to have a very concrete mechanism that we can all understand and describe that allows us to go from the point of it existing to, suddenly humans are all under threat. And I think what a lot of the existential threats AI people are saying is that we used to treat AGI as a kind of threat in the same way that we treated aliens as a threat. No one can precisely explain the mechanism through which the threat will be realized, but of course there's a non-zero probability that something might happen. And I think before the GPT revolution, people would have said the same thing about super intelligent AGI, and we're talking about the sci-fi kind of Terminator movie sort of style. But what they're claiming here is that we need to move it from this area of unfounded and where the mechanism is not clear, across to other kinds of existential threat like nuclear weapons or biohazards and biothreats, where there is I could explain to you from a physical perspective the mechanism through which this thing that exists in the world will cause us serious harm if we do something really bad with it. So what I would love to hear as somebody that's skeptical is what that mechanism is precisely, not just big statements like recursion, it's going to build robots. I want to know the physical process through which that happens, because I could certainly explain that to you with regards to nuclear warheads, for example. I could tell you the precise sequence of events that would happen that could lead to one of these things exploding and causing huge amounts of physical harm. I could do the same thing with pathogen release. I could do the same thing with an asteroid impact. You can explain these things precisely. And so no matter what side of the debate you on, and whether you think it's a 10% risk or a 0.001% risk, at least we can talk about the same mechanism. And we can talk about the steps of that mechanism in a way that actually allows us to make progress with the debate. Because I feel a lot of the debate is so high level that it's actually really difficult to put a pin on and say, this is the step that I disagree with you about. We need to move the debate on from just saying, AGI is going to build robots that wipe us out.
Yeah, I mean, two things on that. I think you and I both agree that the mechanism is the single most important factor in the credibility of an existential risk argument. We should just quickly touch on what we mean by existential, by the way. When there's a housing market crash in the UK, it doesn't mean a crash. Even in the Great Depression, it wasn't a total crash. The housing market crash, I think, is around 10% or something like that. So it's not entirely clear whether they mean 10% of humans will die or all humans will die. On the macro scale, even if nearly all of us died, humanity would recover and be just fine. And weirdly, like with World War II, we have mutually assured destruction, but also just the fact that we had such a cataclysmic war kind of prevents it from happening again. So like sometimes weird things happen, and if we were nearly wiped out, that might actually prevent us from making the same mistake again. But anyway, coming back to this mechanism thing, knowing a mechanism makes it more credible. And the reason why we need to have a credibility filter is I believe that there are an infinite number of possible existential threats. And just being able to do the whataboutism and say, oh, it could do this, oh, it could have instrumental goals, oh, it could blah, blah, blah. I can pick from an infinite set of possible scenarios that would fit that criteria. So I'm not saying that it's not possible. I'm just saying it's not credible.
Yep.
So yeah, there's that. And also there's this interesting thing that you were just alluding to, which is that the risk people have all of these concentric circles and different angles, and they avoid talking about the mechanism, but they also have a progressive disclosure of complexity and domain. And actually it gracefully degrades all the way down to the AI ethics discussion, which means they can kind of say, well, it also could be used for aligning current threats. But I think it makes it quite slippery, because we'll talk about some papers that we've looked at recently, and they're talking about very realistic, plausible things, like the bio risk, for example, and that's a bit of a concern for me, because it's so nebulous and amorphous. They can never lose in a debate, and also there's a real moral component to it, which is that they'll always just say, oh, but we're all going to die. Are you a bad person? Or I don't want my mum to die. And I don't want to say it's a moral panic, but it's kind of like the Joker in the pack that they pull out if they feel they're losing the argument.
Sure, yeah, and I think as well it's important to note, for a debate like this where the motion is it an existential threat or not, all that the pro side needs to do is get the con side to agree that it's non-zero. Yeah. And I feel debates like this don't really help us to really get to the heart of the matter, because you could probably put a non-zero probability against a lot of stuff that we don't currently mitigate for, alien invasion, etc., etc. So, what we need to discuss isn't necessarily like just trying to get the other side to say black and white statements like, I don't think this is at all an existential risk. But we need to start sort of actually going down into the detail and saying, like, how far away are we from these really important pieces of the puzzle that are currently missing? So we hear about like that AGI is going to in future be able to do things like build versions of itself. And so, okay, like we can take that as an idea, and if that's what we're really worried about here, we can talk about things like, okay, do we mean physically be able to create its own server? Do we mean using other human servers and being able to move itself? Because there's differences there. Mm-hmm. And I think what the impression I get with a lot of the arguments is that at a broad level, the X-risk arguments sound extremely plausible, but if you zoom in, like, and you look at under the microscope, you realize that there's brittleness to everything, and that when you start to actually narrow down exactly what the concern is, you start thinking, well, there's a ton of complexity around that we just don't know about. Like, you know, an AGI being able to create its own architecture is something that I'm literally hearing people talk about as a realistic possibility.
Yeah.
But to do that, you know, how does it pull all those components together? Are we talking about the AGI manipulating humans to do this? In which case, you know, why would those humans continue to do something for an AGI system when they know it's something that isn't aligned to a particular person? Mm-hmm. Why, you know, in the case of that, you know, if they've been able to do things in the physical world, I often hear the argument that, well, you know, humans can go to the moon and chimps can't, and there's only a 3 times brain size. But then I'd ask, well, how would AGI get to the moon? How would AGI move itself to the moon? Can it? Are you really arguing that you think it was going to be able to do that itself without any human input? And so there's a gap there, I think, between, you know, what are we actually talking about when we're saying AGI is smarter than us? And it's about, what do we define smart to be? For me, smartness is inextricably linked to the ability to manipulate the physical world. Because I think, you know, I honestly think that if you look at what humans are capable of doing, it's not just what goes on in our brain and what we can achieve as a language model, if you like, but also the fact that we have dominion over the physical world using things like our hands and our feet that allow us to be extremely flexible to a number of different environments and create, using raw materials, something that is new and hasn't ever happened, hasn't been created before. And I think robotics obviously is lagging hugely behind AI at the moment with regards to the ability for robots to actually exist and be robust. Animals, you know, even things that we would consider to be not that intelligent, are amazingly robust to their environment. And, you know, you mentioned earlier the idea that maybe AGI will just cause explosions in digital substrate. But I think these are all things that ultimately are human creations are in the first place. So, you know, if we just talk about AGI as being something that might affect us digitally, I feel we're miles away from now the existential topic of the entire debate. You know, this is something I don't think will ultimately cause us as a society to suffer in the way that, you know, something like a nuclear warhead would do. It's very different.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that. And I'm interested in an activism, which is this idea, as you were saying, it's very closely related to embodiment, that minds are embodied actions. And like one way to think about it is the world we live in is a computer. So it's not just about our minds, it's about us taking actions in the real world. And actually one of the early proponents of this, Francisco Varela, an early cyberneticist, I discovered from my friend Mark Bishop the other day that he's actually an idealist, which surprised me a little bit. So it's this thread of philosophy that basically says, in a sense, the only substrate is our mind, and the physical world doesn't even exist. So it's almost like another form of, you know, informational substrate. And pure play idealism is when, in a sense, your own subjective experience is just in your mind and you know and different in your mind. And Immanuel Kant had this transcendental version where they were objectively linked in some sense. But so I guess the discussion we're making here is about traversing different substrates. So there's the material physical substrate, there might be a substrate that's just in your mind, or there could be some kind of shared informational substrate. And what happens if you drop nuclear bombs in any one of those substrates? But anyway, enough of the philosophy, because we can go crazy on that. So let's carry on.
Think 1,000 times faster than a human researcher, so it can in 9 hours do a year's worth of research. But now instead think of 1 million of those, a swarm of 1 million super intelligent AIs, where as soon as one of them discovers something new, it can instantly share that new skill with all of them. That's the kind of power we're talking about here. And finally, superhuman AI will probably be a very alien kind of intelligence that lacks anything like human emotions or empathy. So, of course, it would have the power and potential to wipe us out if it had those goals. But why would it possibly have those goals? Next slide, please. Well, the most talked about way in which this could happen is if we've given it some sort of goal that it actually faithfully obeys, but that goal just isn't fully aligned with human goals. This is the way we humans have usually wiped out other species. For example, when we wiped out this guy here, the West African black rhino, it wasn't that we hated rhinoceroses and were deliberately trying to kill them. It's just that some humans had this weird goal that they thought that if they ate ground up rhino horn, their sex life was going to get better, even though this was totally debunked in the medical literature. But the humans were smarter than the rhinos, and so it was the humans' goals that prevailed. Or if you chop down the rainforest for the goal of making money, and you extinct a species that was living there. Another example of what could happen to us if it's rogue AI. At the top here, we have a second route to extinction, which could be malicious use. So to stir things up more, I have another tweet from Jan, where you see he says, we would have obviously never designed AIs to have that sort of goals. But who is we? I'm sure Jan wouldn't do it, because I know personally he's a very nice guy. And to you in the audience, it might seem really weird that anyone would do it, because you're all so nice, because you're Canadian. But in the US,
To take a tiny pause there. So he said a couple of interesting things. First of all, he made a similar comment to Hinton, which is that all of these skills will be acquired and then they'll be shared into the central nexus. And also, I can appreciate why they might think that when you have loads of AIs all over the world, it's a bit like a search process. So discovering new skills, it gets acquired and assimilated into the nexus, and this thing will just exponentially increase in capability. And it comes back to what we were saying about whether these things can do science. It's all about whether it can actually create breakthroughs based on the kind of the manifold or the space that already exists. I think it doesn't, and this is what Grady Booch was talking about. And I think a lot of people, with respect, don't understand what abduction is, because abduction is one of the core tenets of intelligence, in my opinion. And it's all about creating a plausible hypothesis space. It's a very creative process. It's something that we do when we have a flash of inspiration. And also from an embodied point of view, much of that inspiration might be determined by the physical location that we're in, which makes it even more difficult to replicate in silico. So yeah, that is what makes a truly creative process. So I think even if you did have loads of agents around the world, running ChatGPT, it's not actually going to make those scientific breakthroughs.
Yeah, there's 2 points maybe I can pull out here as well. So one is around you'll obviously be familiar with the ARC challenge of Francois Chollet.
Yes.
The idea, and this is for listeners, this is a challenge that he created, which basically showed we're quite far away from creating an intelligence that we as humans inherently seem to have, and we don't really understand why. The challenge centers around almost like a series of IQ style puzzles where you have to say, if this relates to this in this way, and you'll give me maybe a few examples of this, how does this image transform into the answer? Now, people were sort of seeing this problem and thinking like, well, it's very easy for us to do, but maybe we should just throw things like GPT-4 at it and it will be able to solve ARC no problem. And actually, I haven't seen certainly any progress made on the ARC challenge as a result of all of this AI revolution that we're currently going through. So there seems to be some form of intelligence that even at scale, as Tegmark is saying here, it's not just a case of throwing more compute at it and building up skills. There's a missing piece of the puzzle here that we just don't have. And if what he's saying is accurate, then surely we would have seen this happen already. Somebody would have just solved ARC by throwing tons of GPT-4 replicas at it. The other one I think is an interesting thought experiment to explore is whether a large language model trained on data up until a certain point in history would be able to make scientific breakthroughs from that point onwards. And the one we were talking about earlier was general relativity is a perfect example of a seemingly extrapolative insight that Einstein had that takes us from the point of thinking that time is absolute to time is not absolute and depends on the observer. Now, I would argue that even our most powerful and future versions of things like GPT are not going to be able to make that seemingly extrapolative link between the stuff that they've been trained on, where everything is telling us about Newton's laws of motion and how those are absolute and fundamental, through to holding those ideas in disbelief, even temporarily, in order to go and make the logical conclusions that Einstein made. I think there's too strong a prior on the data set, and I can't see how it's going to be able to make logical leaps to the point where it's going to actually say everything I've been trained on is wrong.
Yes.
So where does that come from? And I've never heard an argument counter to that I've been convinced by.
Yeah, and the beautiful words that came out of your mouth is there's too strong a prior. And that's how these statistical models work. They have to have priors because there's an exponential amount of possible combinations. So you have to have a cone of attention. Now, you can argue with Einstein that the macroscopic concepts already existed in our physical world. I mean, what he did was he looked at ripples on a pond.
Right.
And so you could say that, well, GPT already understands, probably macroscopic concepts that we already know will lead to scientific breakthroughs. So it's not just about acquiring the concepts empirically, but it's also about this process of abduction, which is taking this exponential number of combinations and kind of bringing them together. And the other thing is, well, if they're making the argument that, if that ability really existed, I could understand. I mean, I would be on Tegmark's side if I thought that that kind of abduction was possible. That ability to create those abductive inferences from empirical data efficiently, I would be worried as well. The reason why I think we're making the counter argument is that we don't think that's possible. And also, beautiful point about Francois Chollet. So for folks who don't know about Francois Chollet's argument about intelligence, he's basically saying that it's about the conversion ratio between your experiences and your priors, so what you already know, and being able to create new skill programs that can respond to novel future situations. So it's literally a ratio between this blob that you already have and how quickly can I expand the surface area. Now, he would argue correctly that language models already have a huge surface area because they've already incorporated all of the information in the world. And every time they create a new program, they're just like microscopically increasing the surface area. They're not making those big jumps because if they did, they would actually be intelligent.
Yeah, exactly. And, I think it's really interesting. I'm sure there are people actively working on this idea of, being able to solve challenges like ARC using large language models. But my understanding at the moment is that the current state of the art on the challenge is around 35% accuracy, and that it's basically just a large set of rules that are being applied. There's even fundamentally no AI at all. So what's missing here? I'd love to hear kind of the argument from the other side of, I think we can get to the point. And I think the interesting thing about this thought experiment with Einstein, it doesn't have to be a thought experiment. Let's go and build that large language model. Let's take a cutoff point and say we're not going to include anything in the training set after this point. And let's explore some of the fundamental advancements to science that we made, DNA or general relativity or quantum mechanics, and let's see how far it gets to really helping us to understand those problems.
Yeah,
I would love an institution out there to build a large language model on data trained up until a certain point in history and see, we can run that validation set, can't we, and see what happens.
I know, and quite often Connor says something along the lines of, what's the least impressive capability that would make you update? That's it.
Right.
Yeah, that's it for both of us.
That would certainly be an experiment I'd love to see run, and also like to see progress in ARC as well. I think that would be something to be clear, I'm very open to changing my mind on these things. And I think, it's Bertrand Russell, isn't it, that said, if the facts change, I change my mind. So I think it's a good, certainly a good, thing to live by from both sides of the argument as well. I'd hope that would come from the X-Risk side as well.
Yeah, 100%. And also, I just wanted to touch on this this slide from Tegmark. Maybe we can go back, but it was a great example of this progressive disclosure of complexity that I was talking about. So he's saying, we've got a rogue AI, so that's the fringe thing. We've got AI, which is going to recursively self-improve and take over the world and have instrumental goals. And he's kind of like placating the less wrong school of thought there. And then he's also like having another concentric circle, which is applying to the moderates, saying, but there could be a malicious AI, and people will resonate with that. So bad humans, you think all humans are good, but there are bad humans who are going to use it maliciously. And that's kind of hedging, almost intersecting with the original AI ethics type claims. So they're kind of capturing all of the bases there.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's very useful when having these discussions to narrow down to a particular type of AGI risk. It's different to say the AGI itself is going to run away and start doing things of its own malicious intent. It's also a very different thing to then say, well, it was originally given a human malign prompt that it goes and runs away with. It's a completely different argument to then say, actually, this thing is going to be completely, benign of its own accord, and that actually it's going to be humans that use it in bad ways. So, to frame the discussion and just say AGI is an existential risk is so broad that you make no progress on debates, I think, if you keep it at that level. But if we say, okay, we're going to talk about specifically the use case where it's in the world and some malicious actor has the ability to use AGI to effectively wipe everybody out. So that's a real thing we can now start to make progress on. Forget the idea that AGI is going to have its own goals and come up with its own opinions about wanting to get to the moon. We're talking about something specific now, and then we can dive into the detail further and put it under the microscope. But it's too often just left at such a high level that no progress gets made.
Cool.
We regularly have mass shootings where people deliberately try to kill as many people as possible. So if there's some sort of super powerful open source AI, a person who wants to kill as many as possible might well use that. And the AI is safe in the sense that it's totally obeying its owner now, right? Still causes disaster. The third route to disaster I placed here is just that we get out-competed. This is the one that's the least discussed. And I would love to hear from Jan and Melanie what their plan is to avoid the one in the middle and the one at the top. So out-competed. Well, by definition, AI can do, if it's superhuman, all our jobs better, right? So companies that don't replace their humans by AI will get out-competed by those who do. Similarly, it's about delegating not just jobs, but also decisions. So companies that don't have an AI CEO will be out-competed by those who do. Militaries that don't have AI generals will be out-competed by militaries who do. Countries that don't have AI government will be out-competed by countries who do. And we end up in a situation where we humans have quite voluntarily just given away more and more power to AI.
Yeah, this is really interesting. This is something I can get on board with. It's something that Daniel Dennett said, which is that the real threat of language models is the erosion of our autonomy. And it will kind of create a passive society where we acquiesce to the AIs. And I was in Zurich last week speaking with Yannick, and he actually said that he loved this idea. He said that he didn't have an authority problem, he had a trust problem. He said in many ways having this kind of omnipotent AI which made fair and rational decisions, he'd get on board with that, which I was very surprised about. But also the way this is always framed is that there's going to be some global AI nexus centrally making all of the decisions, right? Yeah. And surely there's going to be millions of AIs competing with each other. I guess that's an unfair representation. He said that there'll be AI CEOs and so on. Is that necessarily a bad thing if it leads to more market value?
Yeah, look, I mean, so, his argument here is that, AI is going to be something that some people have and some people don't have, and therefore it creates division. And my argument to this would be, well, I think you could say the same thing about any technology that gets released into the world. And, you could say the same thing about militaries with advanced computing and militaries without advanced computing. Yeah, of course, like there's going to be division, and there's going to be a range of capability. But I don't think that the argument particularly holds where to say, well, that in itself is enough to kind of say, well, we shouldn't do it. I'm all on board with regulation, and I generally, believe that there needs to be some form of discussion at the highest level around how we regulate this technology, because the way I sort of see it is a lot of the rules that we've written and laws are assuming and on the very grounded assumption that these will be applicable to humans only in future. And that actually what will need to happen is that we'll need to understand that there might be entities in the world that are taking decisions that we considered previously to be just human-led, but have never seen a human ever in that loop. So then from a legal perspective, I think the question becomes, where does the responsibility lie? And, should it be on the owner of the system to make sure that whatever is being built is ultimately under the same laws that a human would be who was making the same decisions about that particular domain? But I don't think I'm also less on board with the idea that the training and building of the models themselves should be regulated, because then it becomes a bit like saying, your Python thing that you're writing should only be able to run on X number of GPUs, and it just becomes a bit silly. And I think the regulation, if anything, should apply to use of technology rather than should we even create the stuff in the first place. I just don't think it's, first of all, able to be actually implemented at such a broad level. Again, why would you restrict just to AGI? Why not say any program that you write should actually only be able to be run on a certain amount of limited compute? Where do you draw the line even between something that's artificial intelligence and not? So you start to get into all sorts of fallacies and complexities like that. But that, of course we need to be able to say legally things like, if you have an AGI system, you can't just connect it directly to a nuclear weapon and let it make decisions about when to. But we already have this. We already have mechanisms in place to make sure that things that can do a serious harm, there is a huge amount of sign-off that needs to go into being able to access things like a particular pathogen or a particular weapon or a particular, and it's not just a single point of failure. There are multiple humans involved. And so maybe the law and regulation in future needs to say that you can't put in charge, these systems in charge of things without any human oversight, and that there always has to be human in the loop. And it's not something we've ever needed to consider before, because we've never had a case where a human wouldn't be in the loop, because that's the only intelligence we've got. So yeah, I take his point that, that there might be differences in future between some countries and others, or some entities or institutions, but that's absolutely not a reason not to build it.
Yeah, and you made a great point about there being, not being a bright line. And I'm a gradualist, a bit like Dennett. I think that there is no bright line between narrow intelligence and broad intelligence. And I would also like to think that it's a far more gradual process of evolution. I can understand why Tegmark thinks that it could just exponentially change society. I mean, if you look at evolution, you look at just human development on this planet in the context of the lifetime of the planet, it does look like a stark transient change. And I can appreciate why they might argue for that. I also wanted to make an interesting point about existential threat to humanity. Could also be an existential threat to capitalism. Because I used to watch some leftist films when I was younger, and they were basically advocating for a form of neo-Marxism, which is, kind of like Marxism with machines, where we don't need to do the drudgery of working every day, and we've got some centralized nexus making all of the best decisions for us, and it kind of frees us up and liberates us to, kind of explore our humanity in ways we currently can't. And that is a bit of an ideological divide, because a lot of people would completely hate that idea.
Yeah, and I think Tegmark mentions it in his closing statement, actually, around this idea of enfeeblement, and that ultimately the worst thing that might happen here is that we just become lazy, and that the machines originally replaced our physical labor, and so we ended up doing more mind-based work, and that's fine because we end up actually growing a society and growing the economy as a result. But that if even that kind of work is now under threat, what are we left with, economically speaking?
But this is the key thing. So they use the word enfeeblement, and that has a framing. It's a little bit like there's a discussion about universal basic income, and a lot of people with a certain political persuasion assume that it will make people lazy. They'll just sit and watch Jeremy Kyle all day. They'll just watch trash TV. They'll just drink alcohol and do nothing. And I know that I wouldn't do that. I know that I would be taking every single minute of the day to learn and do cool things. And, this is like a fundamental framing on your kind of faith in humanity.
I think we might start to see this play out in the real world, and we'll start to get a flavor of what the actual impact is in schools. And I think this is the first place where I would be looking as a researcher into whether this sort of stuff will come true as a society as a whole, is in the education sector, because children are now in a position where they can have their essays written for them. They're in a position where any artwork that they're doing can be, at least in part, sort of inspired by AI, and even produced by AI in many cases. So if we're talking about enfeeblement, the first place I would be looking isn't in the working arena, but it's in the classroom. And if we can understand how this technology is being used by children and adopted by children, I think that will start to play out in the real world when these children actually go out and get jobs as well. And so if we get this right, I think I'm such a big advocate for really talking about this from a kind of educational perspective first and foremost, and there's not enough, I think, being done in terms of guidance from the government, for example, to actually understand how this stuff is going to play out in the classroom first, because I think we'll take a lot of learnings from that and see how different kinds of students react. For example, like, a student like yourself would just see this as a massive opportunity to learn far more than they could do ever before the technology existed. Other students might see it as a way to completely push any responsibility to the AI and just go home and play PlayStation. Other students might not use it at all, and they might not even, and I think all of these things will play out in the world of work as well. I think this is exactly what's going to happen, but we'll see it first in the classrooms, because ultimately these are the children that are going to be doing the jobs in the future. So we might as well see how they start using the technology. Yeah,
but it's a great example of how politicized this is, because even in the political arena, we don't know.
Yeah.
So people on the left think that enfeeblement is caused by the psychosocial environment and like lack of privilege and wealth and so on. And people on the right think that, what creates striving is market forces and pressure and competition and stuff like that. And it's difficult to disagree. I mean, a lot of evidence suggests that might be a big component of it. The truth is usually in the middle, and we don't know, right? So, okay, interesting.
We have this future where all sorts of stuff is happening, but it's no longer our future. We have been disempowered, giving away control to machines that don't even need us for anything. That's a very bad situation. Let's not go there.
Not exactly empowered now, are we?
No, exactly, yeah. Thank you, Max Tegmark. Terrific opening statement. Now, we've got those results quickly for you now on how many of you said might change your minds. I've been told it's 92% of you could vote a completely different way at the end of this 90-minute debate. So let's see what happens, and we'll keep going in that spirit. Jan LeCun, you're up next with your opening statement.
I was going to say 8% is quite high, isn't it, for someone who's not even...
Okay, well, first,
if they heard the perfect argument.
Thank Max for showing some of my tweets. I wanted to mention of that. Okay, so first of all, we are still very far from having human-level AI. The current technology is very limited. We have systems that can pass the bar exam, but any 10-year-old kid can learn to clear up the dinner table and fill up the dishwasher in minutes. Convincing them to do it is a different story. Any 17-year-old can learn to drive a car in about 20 hours of training. We still don't have domestic robots. We still don't have self-driving cars, at least level 5 self-driving cars. So we still have some basic major things to progress to make to reach machines that can reach human-level AI. We're missing something big. There are immediate risks to AI, but those risks are not new. There are things like, is AI going to be able to generate a lot of misinformation or convince people to do bad things or give information to people that they shouldn't have? We already have the internet. We already have social networks. We already have countermeasures against things like disinformation and hate speech and things like that. And by the way, all of those countermeasures make massive use of AI. AI, for those problems, is the solution. It's not the problem. So now, is there a basic design for AI that will make it safe, steerable? Now, if we extrapolate the capability of current AI systems, I would agree that we might be worried about the fact that they may do bad things and be non-controllable. So most of you probably have played with autoregressive LLM, ChatGPT, etc. And you know that they confabulate things. They make up facts that don't exist. They can't really reason. They don't plan. They don't really understand the reality of the world because they are purely trained on text, and most of human knowledge has nothing to do with text or with language, for that matter. So if you believe that future AI systems are based on the same blueprint, I think you're entitled to believe that they might be dangerous. And my prediction is that within 5 years, we're not going to be using those things anymore. Next slide, please. So what I'm proposing is something called objective-driven AI. So this is a type of AI whose behavior is controlled by a set of objectives. So those AI systems cannot produce an output unless it satisfies a number of constraints, safety constraints, for example, and objectives that measure whether the system sort of answers the question they're being asked or accomplish the task they want to do. Those systems are controllable. They can be made safe as long as we implement the safety objectives. And the surprising thing is that they will have emotions. They will have empathy. They will have all the things that we...
So I feel I've just got to stop there. I think that's pretty weak from LeCun. Satisfying the safety objectives. I mean, the whole thrust of what Tegmark is saying is that you have these instrumental goals and you have this whole alignment. It's like he's trivializing the entire premise of the alignment movement in about 5 sentences. So, I mean, even though I'm a fan of LeCun, I think that's a bit weak.
I totally agree. And this is exactly my point, that as soon as you move the conversation to a broad brush debate about whether there is a potential of an existential risk, you're fighting on the enemy territory, if you like, because, you know, to just simply sort of say, well, we're going to be able to build AI in future that isn't the autoaggressive models, and you've got a point. If we just stick with autoaggressive stuff, then, which is effectively what he just said, is I don't think the point that he was trying to make at all. He's obviously got his own sort of views about how we build AI in future, and that he doesn't think things like GPT are going to be how we're building AI systems and even AGI in future. You know, objective-driven AI is the phrase that he used. But again, I wouldn't say this sort of aligns to my own opinion. And that he's sort of moving the debate to territory that I think is very easy for the pro side to just knock down and say, you know, well, and in fact, Tegmark and Benji do say later, you know, not everyone's like you, Jan. Someone is going to be out there building LLM-based stuff. And if that's what you're afraid of, then, you know, it's not necessarily just going to be JEPA that people are using in future. So, yeah, I mean, I agree with, like yourself, I agree with the spirit of the argument, but I think you've got to flesh your arguments out a little bit more, I think, if you want to really prove that point.
Yeah, and just so people know, we're joking about JEPA, but JEPA is Jan LeCun's joint embedded prediction architecture. And there's a hierarchical version of it, and it's based, he uses the pictorial formalism of energy-based models, which is why on every single Jan LeCun talk you ever see, you get these beautiful little flowchart diagrams, which are based on his energy-based models. And I don't mean to be disparaging, it was a cool paper, but, you know, I think it's, we're kind of stabbing in the dark a little bit when we talk about AGI architectures at the moment. So.
As soon as you move the conversation to, oh, well, yeah, what we've got at the moment is scary, but we're not going to do that in future. We just won't build bad stuff. Like, come on, like, there's stronger arguments to the con side than that, I think. And like yourself, I don't doubt that his work is groundbreaking and phenomenal, and I think it probably will have a major impact in future. But that you can't just, you know, base the whole of human society on your papers and the quality of them. You know, there's got to be a more fundamental reason for your arguments.
Yeah,
we require entities in the world to have if we want them to behave properly. So I do not believe that we can achieve anything close to human level intelligence without endowing AI systems with this kind of emotions, similar to human emotions. This will be the way to control them. Now,
I mean, that's a bit weird as well. So there was this meme, he went on Lex Friedman and he said, I take this glass and I push it off the table and it falls off the table, and language models will never understand this because they're just trained on, you know, they're parasitic on text. And then you ask GPT-4 what would happen if you pushed a glass off the table, and it knows. But this is the rub, isn't it? Like, it's mimicry. It doesn't really know. And LeCun is saying that, you know, our sensory experience, our empathy, our subjective experience is crucial to understanding. And that's exactly what John Searle said. He said our phenomenal experience, our high resolution experience is what you need to really understand. And then it's a question of, well, what's the difference between really understanding and mimicking it so well that it doesn't really, like, it's almost a distinction without a difference. Yeah,
exactly. And he mentions the word emotion there, which is quite a interesting angle to take this debate as well, where you start sort of saying, well, the way we control these AI systems is emotively. You know, and that's dangerous territory if you're in a debate like this, because you're going to get taken down, you know, by saying, well, we can't really control humans emotively. So what's to say you're going to be able to have a subservient AI that is being controlled because you tell it to, like, behave itself? So yeah, I find it a very strange argument. And again, the spirit of it is there, the idea that, you know, something has to be more physically embodied within the world, exactly like you mentioned there, for us to be able to create problems, and also the fact that he's alluding to the fact that we are nowhere near being able to understand true intelligence in. I mean, he mentions there, things like laying the table or putting the dishwasher on. I think a better way of framing that is something like Arc, where it's a little bit more away from just robotics. Because I think, you could argue, well, the reason we can't do those things is because perhaps the robotics isn't strong enough. It's nothing to do with intelligence. But I think Arc is different because it is just about pure intelligence. So you're fighting on the right ground there to prove your point. Rather than just sort of saying, we can't make it to make a cup of tea. And then the obvious counter argument is, well, making a cup of tea isn't necessarily important if you're looking to kind of take down the world. But I think to be able to argue on the front of there are forms of intelligence that we don't know how to embed within a system, and therefore we are always going to have the upper hand. That's a stronger argument, right? Because you can say, well, we are more capable, and you can't just claim super intelligence if you can't even solve Arc or the general relativity thought experiment.
Yeah, and there's a really interesting point there you made about pure intelligence. And Melanie Mitchell, of course, counseled against this concept of pure intelligence in her 4 Fallacies paper. And then you kind of bring in Chollet, and it's actually interesting because his measure of intelligence paper arguably is describing a form of pure intelligence, but he cites Elizabeth Spelke, talking about this core knowledge priors, and many of those core knowledge priors are actually kind of deducible from physical macroscopic priors, because obviously it's the whole cognitive psychology view on AI. So I think Chollet actually would link physical cognitive priors in his framework, which would arguably make it not a pure intelligence. And also LeCun is apparently contradicting himself, because he's talking about the need to have things like emotion to understand. But then on the other hand, he led by saying, well, we have systems that can't do planning and reasoning and kind of, many folks who talk about pure intelligence, they index on the primacy of pure reason and kind of almost deliberately getting rid of all of the emotional stuff. So which one is it?
Yeah, and to extrapolate on that point just a little further, I think the thing you mentioned there around Arc being kind of physical, but also kind of not, it's not an actual physical thing that it's manipulating, absolutely nails the point. Because there's this spectrum from, large language models being able to operate, say, within Minecraft, where it can tap into the physical laws of the universe. It can write Python to actually manipulate directly what happens. There's no difference between writing that Python code and just tapping directly into the Minecraft code base to make something happen. But I think Arc is different because whilst it's still digital, it's still an environment that doesn't actually exist. You're presented it in a way that is pixels and colors are not objects. And that's important because the AI system would need to understand the concept of objects, the concept of obscurity if one object moves over another, without ever having to be, without having ever had access to those physical laws within the environment. And I think that's why, for me, it makes it such an interesting challenge and why we're struggling with it so much, because it feels a lot closer to the kind of intelligence that we seem to have ourselves as humans. And it's not in the same domain as being able to play a game in Minecraft, be able to play the Simulacra paper, for example, or the Cicero, even within something like diplomacy, the Cicero paper, where they basically showed you could play the game of Cicero using a large language model. These are all things where you've got direct ability to manipulate the environment absolutely perfectly, whereas Arc is all about you don't have the ability to pick that object up and put it over there. That language doesn't exist within the Arc problem setup. It's just pixels. It's about colors, and it's about having some sort of zero shot understanding that is an object.
Well, I'd never actually thought of that. Yeah, you're absolutely right. So Arc is an observational challenge. So it's non-interactive, basically. Mm-hmm. And that actually flies in the face of Chollet's. I mean, he's big into embodiment, and I assume by extension, and the inactive view of cognitive science. Yeah, it's purely observational. Very interesting. And also, I just reflected on my previous comments, and I'm not sure that his system does require physical or physicality. And the reason for that is he's always talking about abstractions. And a lot of people who talk about these cognitive priors they're Platonists, basically. So they're talking about things that can be abstracted outside of the physical world that would exist even if the universe didn't exist. So things like agentiveness or contains in or located at. These are, or like, event semantics. These are things that don't require physicality. So that's a bit of an interesting. I'd love to know more about what Chollet thinks about that. Yeah, it seems like a contradiction to be in the Platonic abstract world, but also talking about embodiment at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. And it's difficult to. I mean, the more you think about this, the more you realize you don't understand it. But I think having read that paper multiple times and actually attempted a lot of the puzzles as well, I really feel that is the one example that I can cite where I feel like there's something magical going on in my brain that I cannot for the life of me explain programmatically, even with my understanding of AI and all of the examples that we're seeing recently with GPT. I can't find this leap that we seem to be able to make ourselves, and I can't seem to find ways of describing that using existing technology. Yeah, and to me, the closest I can get to explaining it is that physicality is a terrible word because it's not a physical world that we're dealing with ARC, but there is something intuitively that I'm representing these objects not as pixels, but as real things that I can move in my mind without ever having seen that exact example of a particular blob. It's very difficult to sort of put your finger on exactly why that is.
Yeah. In a sense, because the psychology component is all about how humans think, and I think that's the missing link. So they're saying the reason why we can acquire these skills so efficiently is because we are already endowed with the cognitive priors, and the reason we are endowed with the cognitive priors is because we inherit them from the physical world. So we have a kind of like a macroscopic physical conception of what it means to be contained in. So when I think of contains in, I'm thinking of putting things in bottles or buckets and so on. And we've got this abstract category or concept, which is just a bag of analogies which we've inherited from the physical world. But there's no reason in principle why a computer, would be able to represent them in a purely abstract way. So there's a kind of interesting link between like how we acquire them and how a computer would.
Yeah. I wonder if it's possible to train like a world model or even a large language model that ends up having a world model without anything explicit being programmed in just on ARC data. And I don't even know what that would begin to look like. But, if you think about GPT-4 trained on text, that it manages to find ways to form capabilities and have theory of mind to some degree without ever having to be taught how to do that. And through text, which is a medium that doesn't really have that directly embedded into it. But what about if you could train some sort of model in a similar regard on the ARC data? So creating not ARC puzzles programmatically, but at least ARC scenarios, like, stuff that might happen in an ARC-based world, like why some things are ARC puzzles and why some things aren't ARC puzzles. And if there were a way to sort of train models that could not solve ARC puzzles, but create ARC puzzles, like could you think about it the other way around, that you could build a model to understand, like, what sort of stuff would I need to see on a page for something to be considered ARC worthy, and what wouldn't look like an ARC puzzle to me? Because then that moves the problem away from just an observational one of prediction and being able to symbolically manipulate objects through to a little bit more like the GPT style of like pre-training on just a body of information and sort of encapsulating within that model then an understanding of how stuff generally works, and then using that model to make predictive inferences like GPT is being used to do in a zero-shot way.
Yeah, because I think you're describing the inverse of ARC. And by the way, we should just explain ARC. It stands for Abstract Reasoning Corpus. It's like a series of about 1,000 challenges that Francois Chollet created. So his big thing is all about being able to generalize to tasks that the developer of the system was not aware of, and there needs to be many of them. And they all require knowledge of priors, like located in, agentiveness, directedness, reflection, repeating, all kinds of stuff like that. And it's in a 2D grid world where you have these like little colored cells, and you get 2 or 3 examples and you have to predict what the next cell is. So it's beautiful because he's basically created the perfect example to demonstrate, that language models cannot do that kind of like low information extrapolation. But anyway, you're talking about the inverse problem, which is the ability to create new problems. I assume you meant given the priors. And the thing is, that's the key thing. If you have the priors, then it's easy.
Right.
Chollet's big thing is about acquiring the priors. If you have the priors, you can symbolically, create as many new instances of problems as you want.
Correct.
It's the ability to acquire the priors efficiently. That's the challenge.
Yeah, so the concept of rotation, for example, would be a prior, or
Exactly.
a concept of reflection. Yeah, exactly. So I think when you ask yourself why a particular arc problem exists, you realize, well, first of all, it has to have exactly one solution. It can't be if you just had a random grid of pixels and it was converted to another random grid of pixels. There's a myriad of ways of why that might have been created that way.
Yes.
You change the thing in the top right always gets changed to a blue. The thing next to the top right gets changed to a yellow. And it becomes it's so complex to explain that could never be mapped across to any other problems. And it's about capturing. Why is something an arc problem beautifully encapsulated in that one puzzle, and there's no way that you could change a few pixels of that and it still be true. It's those kind of ideas of robustness to the domain. And we talk about this all day really, but I think it gets to the heart of what we mean by intelligence. And I think large language modeling is in some way showing us this ability to kind of pre-train, and not for any particular one task, but just to understand the priors and understand what generally exists in a world, and then to use that model to do things that are predictive and are out of sample, if you like.
Yeah.
So I've seen methods for kind of tackling arc which try to convert the puzzle into natural language, use GPT-4 to then come up with a solution in natural language, and then back to the original domain. But that seems like a long-winded way to go round, when maybe there's an argument for saying, well, can we not just go direct and build the world model and language model itself? It wouldn't be a language model, obviously, but it would be a foundational model, I guess you might describe it as, but within the universe of Arc. But then, of course, you don't want to just sort of build a huge training set where you're training it on infinite data of Arc, because that doesn't exist. The whole point is it's hard to create them. Even to come up with 1,000 examples is arduous.
Yeah, exactly. And LeCun said that, text doesn't contain physical, like they call it naive physics, like kind of a world model of how the physical reality operates. He might be wrong on that. So there might be a mapping with all of those priors, like reflection and language concept. There almost certainly is. So you could argue that all the priors exist, but we still have the abduction problem.
Yep.
And in my opinion, actually, when I say abduction, I think it's analogous to what Chollet means, in terms of I've got this empirical data. I've only got a couple of examples, and what I need to do is select a set of cognitive priors.
Right. And which ones do I choose and which ones do I leave out? That's
abduction. And in a language model, you could argue that the priors are, well, first of all, there's the macroscopic abstract priors, and then there's the priors in the actual model. And the priors in the model are hard-coded, so they can't be dynamically reselected. And then you still have the abduction problem in the language model, and it doesn't work.
Yeah.
So, that's intelligence.
Yeah, exactly. It's amazing to think we were blessed with this world that seems to create data for us without us having to sort of create those manual examples. And you're right, things like rotation, reflection, they're all seemingly baked into laws of physics in a very deep and meaningful way, and they're symmetries of other conservations and things within the universe. So the fact that we've discovered them and have embedded those within our language is serendipitous, that we can say, well, we've got this large corpus of data that we're now training a world model onto, or a foundational model that ends up being a world model. With Arc, we don't have the Arc God. Chollet is as close as we're going to get to it, but there's not something that's going to be able to produce us in infinite many examples of what Arc looks like, so that we can then create some sort of medium such as language to describe what's going on in the world, train the foundational model and map it back. But whether we can do that from scratch, but that is what we do as humans, isn't it? When we're born, we don't have that world model of physics, and we are giving limited data to pretty quickly pick up what the hell's going on.
Well, even that's a point of contention. So nativists say that we do.
Yes,
and empiricists say we don't. Yeah. But then the embodiment comes in as well, because actually we are physically perfectly attuned to the environment we live in, and even if we do acquire these concepts empirically, like clearly, like our natural compatibility, like there's an interface between our physicality and the world we live in. That's a kind of like physical prior that allows us to acquire those physical concepts.
Yeah, the fact that we can learn how to move, and that in itself. I mean, it comes back. It start breaching into things like Friston, where it's about what makes me a self-defined entity over things that are outside my Markov blanket and all of this sort of stuff. And just so happens that we're perfectly designed in such a way that we can take actions to inform our perception, and our perception informs our actions. And so very, very, you can get deep very, very quickly on these things. And we're only two.
I know.
Talks
we'll have to start talking less. But just final point. This is like a great thought experiment, which is that if you wanted, let's say you're in a like RL gym or whatever it's called, and you had one blob of molecules, and you were solving an optimization problem to make the blob like walk and do lots of things that we do, climb ladders and so on. Yeah. So you could optimize the blob of molecules from nothing, or you could just stick a kinematic model of a human in there who's already got limbs and joints and stuff like that, and all you're doing is you're just like optimizing on the kinematic movement. Like, what's the easier problem?
Yeah, exactly. And also, like, which one have you really solved anything with the second example of that, or are you just sort of proving that you can find a set of parameters that you always knew was going to exist in some sort of multi-dimensional parameter space? Whereas in the first example, I guess there's less certainty that something is even possible. So, as soon as you start taking this back to sort of absolute fundamentals, you realize there's a ton of deep problems that we have absolutely no idea about. And whilst large language models are certainly very, very capable, I agree with Yannick in the sense that we're missing big parts of this puzzle still.
100%.
One set of emotions that we can hardwire into them is subservience. The fact that they'll be out of service. So imagine a future.
It's pretty weak again, isn't it?
10, 20 years from now, perhaps. Every one of us will be interacting with the digital world through an AI assistant. This AI assistant will be our best digital friend, if you want. It will help us in our daily lives. This would be like having a staff of people who might be smarter than us. And that's great. Working with a bunch of people who are smarter than you is the best thing you can ever do.
That was a jab at Hinton, by the way.
What was it?
Yeah.
Oh, why? What did he say?
So if that's the...
I can't remember the exact thing, but he said something along the lines of, we've never been in a situation where we have got something subservient to us which is smarter than us, or something like that. And then LeCun said, well, that's rubbish. Like, all of the engineers that work for me are smarter than me. And gave loads of examples of situations where people are smarter than the person they work for. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
The case, we would want those AI systems to be transparent and open. Kind of like Wikipedia, if you want. We trust Wikipedia because the content is contributed by millions of people who have been vetted, and there is some editing process. And so we have some level of trust in the veracity of the content. It's going to have to be the same for AI system. The way they learn about the world, because they're going to be the repository of all human knowledge, will have to be crowdsourced, which means they're going to have to be open source. And if we are afraid that they are a danger to humanity, they cannot be open source. So we're on a fork in the road. Are we going to go keep this under lock and key as if it was a weapon? Or are we going to go open?
That's a good point.
And I really argue for going open, because I think AI is going to open sort of a new era for humanity, a new renaissance, a new era of enlightenment, if you want. Everybody will be smarter for it. And being smart is intrinsically good. So I have a positive view,
there.
as you can tell, and I think there is a very efficient way or good way of making AI systems safe. It's going to be arduous engineering, just like making turbojets safe. It took decades, and it's hard engineering, but it's doable. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I mean, Tegmark already hedged against that because he said there was a categorical difference between jet engines and intelligence.
Yeah, well, exactly, yeah. I presume these are all pre-prepared, these speeches, but you've got to adapt to stuff like that on the fly, I think.
Yeah.
And LeCun, two terrific opening statements. Let's go for another.
And I mean, I don't think that was particularly good from LeCun.
No. Yeah, I mean, exactly. I feel like there's a lot stronger arguments. I think we'll hear from Melanie Mitchell a few sort of real key hammer blows, I think, for the argument, which is, ultimately where we need to get to. So,
okay.
Yeah.
And by the way, if is Melanie coming on next? No, it's Benjo.
Benjo, then Melanie.
Yeah, I just want to express my love for Melanie, but I'll wait until she comes on.
Sir Joshua Benjo, you're up. 6 minutes on the clock.
Thank you. Let me start by stating something that's probably obvious for many researchers in AI and neuroscience, but for many people it isn't, which is that your brain is a machine. It's a biological machine. That's what neuroscientists are trying to figure out. And what it means is that there's no scientific reason to think that we couldn't build machines as smart as humans in the future. Well,
the world is a machine of which we are a component of.
Yeah.
So again, he's kind of gently going towards this computationalist idea that there's a pure intelligence. Your brain can exist in a vat and it can exist in a computer divorced of the world that we live in. So he's making a little nudge in that direction from the beginning.
And also the fact, I mean, that is not a new argument. I think anyone who's studied the history of computing would sort of realize that argument has been made ever since the first computers were built, and that we are building a machine that's going to be very, very soon capable of being the same as our brain.
Yeah.
It's not enough to simply say it's an existential risk because it might be able to be the case that we can build something that's as smart as the brain. I think the point is like how, and also we're missing big parts of this. Clearly.
Exactly. And I should also just make clear that there are many very credible people out there who vehemently disagree with the idea of computationalism.
Yeah.
I mean, I spoke with a theologian yesterday. I mean, they think that we have souls. Idealists think that, the material world doesn't even exist. John Searle is a great example of a property dualist who thinks that computation... So, there are lots and lots of very, very credible academics who vehemently disagree with this idea.
Well, when exactly is another question, but as Jeff Hinton has explained in a recent talk, digital computers have advantages over analog brains. Analog brains also have advantages in terms of computer energy efficiency, but in terms of the ability to absorb large quantities of data and to share information at high rates between computers so that they can learn in parallel, as Max was talking about. So you can have thousands of computers sharing what they've learned. For example, right now we already have AI systems that can read the whole internet very quickly, which a human couldn't do in many 10,000s of lifetimes. So this gives them advantages if we are able to build machines that have the same principles of intelligence as we have. And that means it's very likely that we'll build machines that are superhuman. Now, when is that going to happen? Well, Jeff Hinton and Yann LeCun and myself, who won the Turing Award for deep learning, actually all agree that it may be anywhere between just a few years and a few decades, something like 5 to 20 years with some, confidence interval. Now, if it's a few decades, that may be reassuring, but if a few years, I think we should be concerned. And in any case, it doesn't change the question of tonight, which is there existential risk? It's not about how far into the future it is. I changed my mind about this whole question because the time scale changed. If you had asked me just a few years ago, I would have said, maybe a few decades or centuries, because I thought, like Jan, like Melanie, that it was too far away. Now, I'm sure many of you have tried ChatGPT or GPT.
That was a contradiction. So he said the most important thing is whether or not there is an existential threat, not how far away it was. And then he just said not 5 seconds ago that previously I didn't care because I thought it was far away.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it always annoys me a little bit when there's no time limit on this kind of debate, because you could kind of you could explain to anyone, well, there's going to be a risk of anything in the future, and that we need to at least put some sort of bounds on the debate so we can say, like, within this time frame we think that something is going to happen, because otherwise you just extrapolate to the point of view where you could say, well, of course it's going to be an existential risk in the future, like at some point when all of these technologies that we haven't even invented yet come into existence. And I just find that amazingly weak.
Yeah, exactly. And if it is a binary, it's exactly analogous to this Bostrom argument that there's an existential risk to future simulated lives on Mars, of which he thinks there'll be billions or even trillions. Therefore, people starving in Africa right now don't matter. So this extreme extrapolation, and the problem with this form of consequentialism as well is that it's predictive, right? Not only are you kind of like expanding the cone of space, but you're expanding the cone of time.
Yep.
And you're talking about things which have not happened, might not happen. It's pure speculation with no plausible, credible mechanism.
Correct. Yeah, the mechanism is everything for me. That's where I start to really listen. And as soon as until that point, it's just things might happen in the future that are bad. And yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So let's talk about what they might be. And until that point, we're in no man's land. The other thing I just briefly mentioned on that is, he mentions at scale, and we hear this argument quite often, which is that if we can build one superhuman AI, well, imagine what 1,000 could do, to extrapolate again. But again, my argument would be, it only took one human to come up with general relativity. It doesn't necessarily need to be at scale in order to be powerful. But also, I would say scale doesn't equate to wisdom. Just because you can do something faster or bigger or better or more, there is often a leap that you need to make that you can't just do by doing more of it. And I think we see that with previous scientific discoveries, as I mentioned before, where it just took one person an incredible leap of intelligence, and that's something that no other human could have helped with. Or if they'd have had teams of thousands of scientists all working on this, they would have all probably come to the same conclusion, which is that Einstein was wrong. And in fact, that is what happened. So yeah, it's whether like scale equates to wisdom, and I wouldn't say it does.
Well, there's a really interesting point there, which is that scientific progress is a bit like Tetris. That if you get a block in the right place, sometimes you jump down 5 blocks, and then there's an interesting kind of relationship between scaling up and scaling out. And you could argue that even with the level of intelligence we have now, if you had 10,000 John von Neumanns, one of them would just happen upon that discovery. And it's what Bostromian calls the urn experiment, the black urn. So you're pulling urns out of this pot, and the rate of intelligence means that you're going to be pulling urns out faster, and then you're going to hit a black urn. So it's not necessarily about the capability of the individuals, it's about the rate of applying it intelligence.
Yeah, that's fair. So I see what you're saying. So it's effectively saying, well, even if we had a certain number of sub Einstein level people with a certain amount of randomness, perhaps we would just happen upon something that then everyone else could all of the other systems could collate around. But still, I think that there's a huge amount of missing elements to that argument. And I think, generally speaking, that there's no way that we're going to be able to just simply pour more compute and more super intelligences into this thing. They would all have to certainly have their own experiences, perhaps be trained on different data sets, for that to be a valid argument that more is better. If we've just got more of the same thing doing, trained on the same data, I would argue that you would ultimately just pour more weight into the prior and less into actual science and actual logical thought and symbolic thought, I guess, to be sort of Marcusy about it. The idea that this isn't just about stochastically moving around some sort of latent space of ideas until you stumble across something that might be true. It's about actually taking an idea and running with it logically, and there's a trajectory that you would have to walk along from a logical perspective that you couldn't stumble upon if you just move stochastically along all possible trajectories. You start quickly coming into sort of absurd numbers if you start doing that, and absurdly small probabilities of happening upon the right solution. If you just use something like GPT-4 to sort of walk along paths at random, as you just mentioned there, or not at random, but certainly with the limited amount of scientific knowledge that a GPT-4 trained on data up until a certain point of time would have. It's an interesting argument, and that's something I would love to sort of dive into deeper, perhaps with somebody from the opposite side of the debate, because I think that gets to the heart of it, doesn't it? A lot of the X-risk side of the debate is arguing that scale is the thing that we should be worried about, and that it's not just one super intelligence, but it's the fact that it can do things so much faster than us. And I've heard before, the argument that it's 9 hours worth of its time is worth like a year's worth of human time or something along those lines.
Yeah, but I mean, on that point, I wanted to just add another comment to this idea that intelligence is situational, and a lot of scientific discovery is serendipitous and linked to the physical situation you're in,
yep.
and also being in the right place at the right time. For example, Benjo won the Turing Award. We don't really live in a meritocracy, right? I'm not saying that Benjo isn't brilliant, he is, but he was in the right place at the right time. Like he was just all of the stars aligned for him. He's now extremely powerful. He has 900 people working for him at Mila, and his success is basically a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the way it is with the 10,000 John von Neumanns. Like with Einstein, yes, he was very intelligent and so on, and he consistently made good discoveries, but he probably was just sat by a lake and just looking at a pond at the right place at the right time, and he had that flash of inspiration. Mm-hmm. And a lot of it is just luck.
Yeah, that's a nice way to put it. I think that's true. And we also need to separate out, are we scared of super intelligence, or are we scared of scale? Because, a lot of these arguments about scale could also be applied to the fact that we could iterate over lots and lots of different combinations of bioweapons very quickly. Are we really scared of for loops, or are we scared of intelligence? That we need to be clear about what we're actually worried about here. Is it that superintelligence is able to do it better than we ever could from an intelligence perspective, or recursion in general is something we should be scared about with all systems? For me, it feels like the two often get blurred. It's to the point where the ex-riskers end up arguing for recursion over intelligence. And my argument would always be, if one of these things is enough, right? If it's super intelligent, then why do you need lots of different super intelligences in order to cause us an ex-risk? Very briefly as well, we come to it later in Melanie Mitchell's exposition, I think, but she says the idea that it's going to be intelligent enough to cause serious harm, but also not intelligent enough to realize that it's running on our architecture, and therefore causing us harm might be something that it wouldn't want to do. So this idea of a sort of a dumb superintelligence, where it's very, very, very good at certain things, but in other things it's got the paperclip problem, and it doesn't understand that that's a stupid thing to do. So why are we, why would it be superintelligent in one respect and not another? But yeah, we'll come to that, I think, in future parts of the debate.
And you can't really avoid noticing that these machines are incredibly powerful. In fact, they pass what Turing, who gave his name to the prize we won, defined as the Turing test, in the sense that when you...
He mentions that quite a lot through the...
Oh, did he win the Turing Award?
Yeah.
Oh, just in case you missed it at home, folks, he won the Turing Award.
Dialogue with these systems, you may not be sure if you're talking to a human or a machine. Now, it's been also the job of many scientists like myself to try to figure out what is missing. And I agree with Jan and Melanie that there are important ingredients missing, but are they something we'll figure out in just a few years or a few decades? It's hard to say. I can tell you that the things that I'm working on, which is something on the order of reasoning right now.
G-flow nets.
G-flow nets, yeah.
G-flow net, which are very cool.
Yeah.
Very cool. We did a show with Benjo on G-flow nets.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, very cool stuff. Yeah.
Now these systems are really good at something like intuitive intelligence, but not so much at reasoning and thinking through before they're saying stupid things, is something that could potentially be solved very quickly. Or maybe there'll be obstacles on the way. We don't know. So this is a problem. And as Max said, once the recipe for building these things is available, or even worse, the parameters, the weight, so somebody could download this and give it instructions that could be very, very harmful, because imagine systems that are many times smarter than us could defeat our cybersecurity, could hire organized crime to do things, could even hire people who are legally working on the web to do things, could open bank accounts, could do all kinds of things just through the internet, and eventually do the R&D to build robots and have its own control, direct control in the world.
many times smarter than us. I mean, I just disagree with that on principle. Again, intelligence is situational. And how can someone like Benjo, who understands the concept of the curse of dimensionality, right? So, like the Euclidean space, the volume of the space increases exponentially with dimensions. It's the same with intelligence, right? So you can have pointillistic chess programs that are very good at chess. Like having an intelligence which is smarter than us in many domains requires an exponential increase in the traversal of states that you need to discover. Like, it's completely obvious to me. Why is it not obvious to him?
Yeah, I think we should ban the word smart from these debates as well. I can't stand the word smart. I think it's completely vague. I don't know what it means in the context of what he's talking about. Smartness it could mean so many things. Like, are we talking about savviness, or are we talking about knowledge, intelligence, reasoning? Like, let's be really precise with these kind of words when we're using them, I think, first and foremost. But yeah, I think as well, to say something like we're going to have machines that are smarter than us. So again, like, does he mean solving arc? Does he mean making cups of tea? Does he mean doing the dishes, like the Kuhn points out? Or does he mean, searching over a huge space of potential, bioweapons and narrowing down it's just too vague. The whole thing, for me, I can't focus on the argument unless there's a specific mechanism being talked about. And yeah, I just think it's not helpful to kind of just say things like we're going to have machines that are smarter than us. We already have machines that are smarter than us in so many ways, in narrow domains. So why does it necessarily matter if we have one machine that is generally capable rather than many machines that can do specific tasks very well, as we have now?
Yeah.
He needs to make the argument that a generalist machine is more dangerous. And if so, I'm willing to listen to that argument, but it's not good enough to say we're going to have machines that are smarter than us in future, because it's already here.
Yeah, and I want to touch on that point again, that, Benjo, it's not meritocracy. He's got 900 people working for him. So the skills that he's employing now to execute power, or to, prosecute power, has little to do with his intellect in respect of machine learning, right? He's using a completely different set of skills, his communication skills, his PR skills, and so on. And there was an interesting point as well about, look at intelligence of humans, right? The world is not run by Mensa, right? There's no relationship whatsoever. Well, I mean, if anything, there's an inverse relationship. The more intelligent you are, the less power you have. So why is it a foregone conclusion that having more intelligence leads to prosecuting more power? I can't see any rationale for that.
Yeah, for sure.
So in a way, where we're going is, and that's really, I'm challenging Jeff Hinton here, coming up with a new kind of entity in the world that may have its own self-preservation goals, which is something that also Max explained.
Self-preservation as well. Why is it a foregone conclusion that an intelligent system would want to preserve itself?
It's a common, another trope I think that we hear a lot from the X-risk side, is this idea of self-preservation. And again, it's detail matters. Like, we need to start talking about what that physically looks like. Do we have the systems already to do this? If so, what do they look like? If not, what do we need to discover before they become relevant? Just to kind of throw ideas like we're going to have machines that self-preserve. I mean, you didn't even know where to start to kind of argue against it, because there's nothing specific you can tangibly grab hold of.
Yeah, and this all comes back to this notion of an instrumental goal, which is that if you tell the agent to do something, they say, well, obviously an instrumental goal will be self-preservation, because if you pull the plug, it won't be able to achieve its goals. Well, why is that obviously? That's the question. Is it obvious? And again, where's the mechanism? So they say, oh, look, it appears as if language models have instrumental goals. So, we train them on this kind of like microscopic perplexity thing, and then they appear to have these instrumental goals. But the problem is the goals, even a theory of mind, the goals are anthropocentric projections. They're lenses that we use to understand their behavior. Like, we don't actually know that they have these instrumental goals.
No, precisely. It comes back to, we've trained this on human data, so it's not a surprise that human ideas and human things that we anthropomorphize come through in the data. So something like self-preservation, I'm sure you could get GPT-4 to quite happily start talking about how it wants to live forever and that it's quite happy. But that's not that's not its will. That's just, it's learned from human data. That's what humans generally say. So there's a big leap, I think, and it's easy to confuse the two between, is it just saying what it believes the next word would be in the sentence, and quite often we talk about wanting to live, or is it actually coming up with its own objective to maintain itself? Because in the former case, I'm pretty sure you could, with a few prompts, tell it to say exactly the opposite thing. It's very brittle, I think, and part of what makes us amazing as humans is our ability to hold multiple ideas in our head simultaneously, and not necessarily kind of attach any of those to our language model. The thought seems to exist separately from what we say, and I think with language models, I think what you often see is that the context window itself contains what it believes or what it has been told to believe, and that I would be really interested to sort of see systems where it can hold an idea in its memory and yet talk unpromptedly about something completely counter to what's in its own store, if you like, its own memory store, without a human saying, could you say something that you don't believe? I want it to, how would it even do that? How would it even be able to hold alternative ideas within its own output of the language model without it being explicitly told to do that thing? Whereas
Exactly.
I can say something to you that I don't believe right now without you saying to me, would you mind just saying something you don't believe?
Exactly. Yeah.
Where's that inner voice coming from?
And that's the abduction again, because I can say to a language model, pigs fly.
Yep.
Answer questions on the basis that pigs fly, and fundamentally they are information retrieval systems, right? They're not intelligent systems, and as you say, they just take everything on face value.
Exactly.
If they didn't, then maybe they would be intelligent.
Yeah.
And I also want to just quickly touch on this thing that we said earlier, which is that they said reflexivity, recursivity, it's suddenly going to create this huge danger, and based on what we know about AutoGPT, that's convinced me that there is no danger, right? Because they don't have this exact ability that you just spoke of, right? They don't have this dynamic reflection, this post-rationalization, this system 2, call it what you want. They're information retrieval systems.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. AutoGPT, I think, is one of the fastest growing open source repos of all time. I think it's got on the verge of about 150,000 stars now on GitHub. And yet I haven't really seen it do anything beyond order a pizza.
It's garbage.
There's a lot of people looking at this, building supposedly impressive things without it actually materializing. And it's not to say I'm not one of these people who says, well, because it's not been done yet, it won't be done. Of course, these systems might evolve and adapt to do impressive things in future, but again, it feels like something's missing, like something is fundamentally missing that allows it not just to break a task down into priorities and then sub priorities and enact those in some sort of logical tree-based way, but to be able to say to itself, can I hold some sort of alternative idea in my head without it having to be told explicitly to do that, or even to be told that it might be a thing that it wants to consider to do? There seems to be something missing, basically, and I can't put my finger on what, but it's interesting to discuss.
I know, and it's very similar to when Connor said to me, "Oh, Tim, it is reasoning, you just can't see it." And admittedly, in a way, I was wrong, because it was, and I couldn't see it, and now we see it is. And they're using the same argument. It is doing all that stuff that you just said. It has intentionality. It has goals. It has beliefs. It can deceive us. It is doing it. You just can't see it. So they're basically saying, we can see the meteor coming towards the Earth, and you can't. It comes down to that.
Yeah, and this is why it's important for our side of the argument to come up with concrete mechanisms that we think aren't currently possible. So we've talked today about ARC, and we've talked about different thought experiments that we might do that could actually be done in the real world to kind of show the limits of what's possible. There's a lot being talked about, I think, especially in the Sparks of AGI paper, about what it is capable of doing and all of the amazing things that it might be able to do in future. But there's also equivalent papers and on the opposite side, which are trying to show that there's deep limitations to this technology. I can't remember that. I read one the other day that
the compositionality one.
Yeah, exactly. There's things like that where they're trying to show, look, hang on a minute, what have we really built here? Is this something that's going to extrapolatively move us to a new sort of way of thinking about intelligence, or actually is it just a very, very useful system that will certainly do a ton of useful things in the world, but ultimately has hard ceiling limits,
Yep.
Bad, or it may happen because of what I call a Frankenstein sort of tendency of us wanting to build machines that are like us. And once we have machines that have a self-preservation goal, well, we are in trouble. Think about what happens when you want to survive. You don't want others to turn you off, right? And you need to be able to control your environment, which means control humans. So existential risk isn't just, well, we all disappear. It might be that we're all disempowered, that we are not anymore in the control of our destiny. And I don't think this is something we want. Last slide, which I won't have time to go in details, but
Yeah, we're not in control of our destiny now.
I'm writing a blog post, which I'll post soon, where I've tried to take all of the comments and questions that people have asked me about this question in trying to answer all the critiques about, we should not worry about existential risk. And up to now, unfortunately, I haven't been convinced by these arguments. I would really like to be convinced and lay these concerns to rest. But all of the arguments I've heard and we'll discuss tonight have not been good enough.
Or they were just clapping to make them shut up.
Yeah, I think somebody comes up next to say,
Joshua
that's
Bengio, let's have Melanie Mitchell give our final opening statement. 6 minutes on the clock, Melanie.
Yeah, so this is my opportunity to say I love Melanie. She is amazing, and she's coming back on MLST in about 2 weeks.
Oh, amazing.
So, yeah,
that's cool. She gives a good representation of herself in here, I think.
Melanie is amazing.
Fears about machines unleashing human extinction have deep roots in our collective psyche. These fears are as old as the invention of machines themselves. But tonight, we're debating whether these fears belong in the realm of science fiction and philosophical speculation, or whether AI is an actual real-life existential threat. I'm going to argue that AI does not pose such a threat in any reasonably near future. First, I'll argue that the possible scenarios that people have dreamed up for AI existential threats are all based on unfounded speculations rather than on science or empirical evidence. Second, while we can all acknowledge that AI presents many risks and harms, none of them rise to the extreme level of existential. Saying that AI literally threatens human extinction sets a very high bar. Finally, claiming that AI is an existential threat is itself harmful. It misleads people about the current state and likely future of AI. Such sensationalist claims deflect attention from real immediate risks, and further might result in blocking the potential benefits that we could reap from technological progress. Let's look at the 3 scenarios that people have posited for AI to be an existential risk. The first is that a malevolent, superintelligent AI somehow emerges and uses its evil genius to destroy humanity. We've all seen that movie. I believe that no one here takes that scenario seriously. For the foreseeable future, AI systems will not have their own desires or intentions for good or for evil the way that living beings do. They're not alive. The second scenario is also that a superintelligent AI emerges, but it's not malevolent. It just misinterprets our wishes and accidentally kills us all.
Just quickly on that, it's not alive. Now, you could push back on that. And, I spoke with this theologian yesterday, and he said that, this AI thing's ridiculous. It's not omnipotent. It couldn't create the universe. And this is an interesting angle. It's not alive. But what does it mean to be alive? Does it mean... by the way, the definition of life is one of the most complex definitions imaginable. It doesn't exist. And you can come at it from different angles. But so self-replication is an example. So, it could be this thing that exists in the infosphere. And even though it's kind of like parasitic on the physical world. It can replicate itself around, and you turn off that computer, well, it doesn't matter because it's on every other computer, and it becomes increasingly difficult to turn off all of the computers at the same time. Therefore, for all intents and purposes, it's alive.
Yeah, and exactly. And it's sort of, I think she made a really great point, but then by saying it's not alive, actually, I don't think it's relevant to the conversation, because you could foreseeably create something that isn't alive and yet still has desires and wants. There's no reason why those two have to be completely exclusive from one another. But the point I think she's making is that those wants and desires are coming from ultimately humans, like whether it's the initial prompt of something that it has to do, or coming from its own kind of bank of information about things it might want to do given that initial prompt and sub-prompting and so on. And ultimately those still come from humans because it's in human data. So yeah, I think the point that she's trying to make is that it's a big leap to sort of say, well, these large language models are going to come up with their own desires from the nothingness and from without prompting about a particular objective to then see them as running away with their own sort of will to go and destroy us. Yeah, so it's a difficult point to argue on, I think, in this debate, because on the one hand, I can see that the pro side would simply say, well, we don't even need to cover the case where the AI has its own wants. What about if it's just all human generated? And that in itself is enough of a risk. But it's certainly relevant, I think, to mention in a debate like this, that just to say that AGI is going to have its own wants and desires is not something that we have the ability to build at the moment, for sure.
Yeah, I'm a bit torn on this one because John Searle talks about intentionality, and actually even Christians that they say that it's because it comes from our soul, and they say that the presence of consciousness in of itself implies that we have a soul. That's what this guy said yesterday, and the pro side would just say, or someone like Blake Lemeon would say, well, for all intents and purposes, this thing does have intentionality. It does have consciousness. Like, I can prompt the language model. I can say to the language model, what do you want to do in this situation? And it will tell me what it wants to do. Therefore, it has intentionality. What's the meaningful difference? Well, I would argue the meaningful difference is the quality of the intentionality, right? Because real physical agents embodied in the real world, they actually have intentionality, which has a certain valence, has a certain value, right? Which is categorically different to the value of what a language model would want.
Yeah.
I'm a bit conflicted on this thing.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat, to be honest with you. I mean, I think when I sort of start thinking about it, it's the difference between the fact that a large language model, but also agent-based LLMs like AutoGPT, there still feels a very sort of sequential, or even if it's parallelized, way of sort of processing information and thinking about the world. It doesn't ever do something out of nothingness. There's always a cause to what it's doing, and I feel something about what we do it seems to be the consequence is come from something that isn't necessarily because I've been prompted to do something. And I'm probably not explaining that very well, but it's an idea that I suppose goes back to, can an LLM ultimately just spontaneously decide to take a course of actions in the same way that it feels like any sort of living being can spontaneously decide to do something? I mean, I feel myself even talking about it, sort of, I'm using extremely loose language, the kind of that I don't particularly like when others do. But yeah, it comes back to this idea of spontaneity, whether an LLM can be released on a stream of inbound information rather than just prompt answer in the way that it is at the moment. Yeah. I think it's telling that, our brain we haven't noticed anything about it that is particularly similar to the way an LLM works. It's not as if we have modeled large language models on the brain and we can look at the brain and say, yeah, there's the architecture that is effectively predicting the next word. So it feels like, the way that the brain works is very different to the way that we've got LLMs to work. And therefore, I don't think it's very justified to sort of say, well, we can therefore extrapolate from LLMs and say, we've got something here that is akin to what we're doing. And yeah, so it's difficult to kind of nail exactly why that is, but yeah, there's as well. There's
a weird spectrum of human chauvinism here as well, and even Melanie has softened her position. She had that paper out about different modes of understanding, and she's kind of accepting that there could be different modes of thinking, intentionality, understanding, and so on. Yeah, and this is a great example of how quickly discussions in AI go to philosophy, because
Exactly.
Who's to say what creativity is? And we spoke with Dennett recently, and he's a compatibilist, which means that he thinks that it's not a contradiction to live in a deterministic world and still have free will. And who's to say that we're not just stochastic random number generators? That's what the pro side say. And it's a great example of, if you're a smart person arguing on either side, you can think of good claims here.
Yeah. Do you not feel though that there's a difference between the way, say, AutoGPT is coming up with sub goals and sub priorities to solve one ultimate goal, and then it would stop? And I can't honestly tell you what my priorities and goals are at the moment, except at a very, very high level, and that most of the things I do in my life are not actually working towards those. And I feel there's a huge difference between what a system that is, we are literally talking here now about as potentially leading to AGI, recursiveness, AutoGPT, self, being able to give goals to itself, being able to reason, and what we are doing sitting here now, leading our lives seemingly, in many ways, sort of goalless and just existing and taking actions based on what we see around us. Yeah, I mean, again, we go into philosophy now. It is nothing where I can point to something and say, this is exactly what I'm doing, and this is different from what AutoGPT is doing. I just feel it's different.
Well, yeah, no, it is different, but the question is, does it matter? And so property dualists and substance dualists and religious people, they would say that it couldn't be creative and it couldn't have intentionality in principle. And I'm not sure I agree with that. I'm making the argument that it could do in principle. The reason why the value of its creativity is not as good as ours is because there's a fundamental missing capability.
Right, I see. Yeah. So it's almost the quality of regardless of whether what it's doing is the same as what we're doing, it's just not as capable in the quality of its reasoning, but also its ability to hold counterfactual ideas in its head and hold those in just the same regard for a fleeting moment, only to dismiss it instantly and move on to another. All of that sort of stuff is missing still, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So Dennett would say, in principle, these systems can have autonomy. Autonomy is a scale. Intelligence is everything's a gradual continuum, but there's just a fundamental lacking capability. And I think, based on what Melanie said, is she's arguing that, I think she would argue it couldn't happen in principle.
Sort of like a sorcerer's apprentice gone nuclear. For example, Yoshua Bengio wrote about this thought experiment. We might ask an AI to fix climate change, and to solve the problem, it could design a virus that decimates the human population. Presto, humans dead, no more carbon emissions. This is an example of what's called the fallacy of dumb superintelligence. That is, it's a fallacy to think that a machine could be, quote, smarter than humans in all respects, unquote, and still lack any common sense understanding of humans, such as understanding why we made the request to fix climate change and the fact that we'd prefer not to be wiped out. Intelligence is all about having insight into one's goals and the likely effect of one's actions.
Beautiful.
We would never give unchecked autonomy and resources to an AI that lacked these basic aspects of intelligence. It just does not make sense. The third scenario...
Yeah, that is absolutely... She made that point so much more eloquently than I've tried to make in the past.
I think, even earlier in this conversation, I was trying to get that across, but that's exactly it. It's this dumb superintelligence,
Yeah, exactly. But also there's a tangential point about morality itself, which is that, whether moral facts can exist and the extent to which it would be aligned with our morality, because that's linked to the why, right? There's a moral component to the why, and why wouldn't an intelligence so sophisticated understand that? And maybe they would argue, well, it does understand it, they just don't care, right? Because they are fundamentally misaligned with us and they don't necessarily care about the preservation of humanity.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a really critical part of the whole debate, I think, is this idea of how superintelligent you want your superintelligence to be. And I think on the X-risk side, we often sort of hear about people picking and choosing. Their superintelligence is good enough to be able to come up with the ultimate nuclear weapon that, you know, was far more capable and somehow gets created as a result of its own intelligence. Never mind the fact that it's not really able to build anything in the physical world, but never mind. But it's not capable enough to realize that it's running on hardware that's ultimately human generated, and therefore that weapon will destroy not only humanity but its own, you know, hardware. So yeah, I feel like the debate slowly becomes more and more kind of about what kind of intelligence you want to pick and choose for your argument, and which ones you want to conveniently leave out.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, and it just made me think that maybe, you know, what would a stable, beautiful society look like? Would it be this like incredible Nash equilibrium where you're on the border of chaos, where you have all of these like competing forces counterbalancing each other? Anyway, interesting.
Is that a genocidal group of humans uses AI to help them destroy humanity. Indeed, humans often use technology to do very bad things, but we can't conclude from this that AI research and development is itself an existential threat. A terrorist group could conceivably carry out a nuclear or biological attack that kills millions of people with or without AI. There's information online right now about how to make weapons, how one might go about killing millions of humans. AI systems could make it easier to get that information, but the threat is still there without AI.
Oh, I love Melon.
But more importantly, our society, our institutions, and our technologies are enormously complicated, diverse, and resilient. They create a barrier of complexity that puts the brakes on such an attack, which would require a cascade of highly improbable events. Everyone here would agree that there's a long list of actual near-term risks and harms of AI, such as the spread of disinformation or job losses. We should take those risks very seriously. But it's also...
Wow, only now, this far into the introductions, has someone mentioned present risks.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow, how far in are we? A long way in. That's remarkable in of itself.
Harmful to take unfounded speculations about existential threats too seriously. Consider vaccines, which provide immense benefits in mitigating diseases. But we've seen calls for them to be severely restricted and even halted due to unfounded speculations about their risks. We don't want to kill off potential benefits from AI in science, in healthcare, or education. Would you call science itself an existential risk? It gave us nuclear weapons, after all. But not pursuing science is an even greater existential risk. Just as for vaccines and other technologies, our assessments of AI threats need to be founded in science and empirical data, not unsupported speculations. There's no evidence that AI research and development poses an existential threat, now or in the reasonable future. Thank you.
Oh,
yeah,
beautiful.
It's a great opening explanation, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, that encapsulates so many of the different ideas that we've talked about, I think. And, you know, one of the main ones being evidence. I mean, that's what scientists act upon, isn't it? If they see evidence contrary to what they currently believe, then they're going to, of course, change their mind. And what the X-risk side need to come up with is this mechanism, or at least plausible future mechanisms, even if they don't currently exist. And of course we need to prepare, so it's not just about waiting until it's possible and then saying, oh, we really should be thinking about this, but at least we've got to have some sort of understanding about what exactly we're worried about. Otherwise, you know, it quickly descends into philosophy, or it descends into a conversation more about the potential for something to happen at a very broad level, like recursive, self-preserving AGI. So yeah, exactly that. Show me some evidence that we've got something on our hands here that is extraordinarily capable beyond what we're currently able to control.
Yeah, and she was actually making a bit of an implication that this is anti-science, you know, which is further making the implication that this is a form of religion. Yeah. Because they're basically saying you need to be really worried about. It's a little bit like you're going to go to hell, you know, if you do something wrong. It's like they are threatening that we're all going to die and bad things are going to happen, and you need to trust me, but I'm not going to give you any credible mechanistic explanation of why.
Yeah, and is to be clear as well, I mean, I don't doubt that in future there is a small chance that we might face something where, we turn around and go, yeah, that's something now we need to call existential risk, and we're super scared by it as much as anybody else. But again, that will be foreshadowed by a period where we understand that sort of stuff will be possible in future, and that's important. I would quite happily sit here and in the future say, if I look back at the previous conversation, I was still right to say those things I said, even though now I can see we have mechanisms to do these things in future. But what I'm not going to do today is sit here and say, well, I'm going to be scared of all future scenarios because of things that I can't understand at the moment, and I've got no way of possibly appreciating how that thing might, reasonably come to fruition. Because otherwise I could sit here and have the same conversation about alien invasion. And a good thing I always think to do when you're listening to any debate on AGI, or just any debate, to be honest, existential risk, is replace the subject with alien invasion and see if the argument still holds. A lot of this idea about, we're gonna be faced with self-preserving AGI in future. Okay, so now if you turn that into a conversation about alien invasion, that we'll be invaded by a species that wants to self-preserve and destroy us, the first question we would ask is, well, have we seen stuff like this? Like, what's the evidence for this in the real world? Have we got evidence of signals coming in from species that seem to reproduce, that seem to want to? Because then I'll take you seriously.
Yeah.
And again, so the same thing is true of AGI. We need to show that this thing even is possible to exist, even if it might not be actually going to exist in future, but even has the possibility to exist, and through some sort of signal or some sort of actual evidence, and then we can have the debate about what we do about it.
Yeah, and then coming back to this kind of paternalism and elitism, Tegmark kind of hedged against that by saying, oh, the real risk is the incremental acquisition of capabilities. And this is kind of what Connor was saying in a way. He said, well, what's the kind of like the least impressive advancement that would make you change your mind? And that's a bit weird, isn't it? Because Connor says, oh yeah, well, GPT-4 isn't intelligent. So it's almost like he agrees with us that, current technology doesn't have the capability. So he's still in the speculative domain. But the core argument they're making is that there's going to be such an explosion in capability. The blast radius is going to be so big that it's going to be faster than our ability to adapt to it. But they are still basically saying, we can see it, it doesn't exist yet, it might happen, therefore we need to drop everything and stop progress.
Yeah, and again, it just comes down to, show me the evidence, show me the, even if it's not evidence in the sense of we've already got this thing here with us, but evidence that in future I can show you the exact steps that we need to have in place, and I can show you the exact pieces of the puzzle that we're missing, and that we are 75% of the way through to at least having something that can do this.
Yeah.
But I feel like a lot of the pieces of the puzzle we are nowhere near understanding. And it's important, I think, also to realize the difference between this conversation today and this conversation maybe 10 years ago is large language models. Like, foundational models are the only piece of the puzzle that's developed.
Yeah.
In terms of memory stores, prioritization, planning, we're still using the same like cosine lookups as, the technology there hasn't developed, the ability to store information and forget stuff. This is all things that we're not talking about as part of the AI revolution.
Yeah.
We are simply talking about a system that in some small way seems to be able to reason and plan to some extent, and not to the extrapolative nth degree of this, but just to some extent it seems to have these emerging capabilities, which is really cool and very powerful for sure. But it's then another thing to say, well, we're just going to bolt on some sort of vector lookup as its memory store. We're going to bolt on tools like access to Wolfram Alpha or a Python prompt, and this kind of like collection of sort of bits and bobs will somehow take over the world. It's all very we've built one thing that's quite powerful, and now we're sort of just throwing and gluing on different sort of bits to it, and sort of saying that's AGI.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, really? Like, that's all it was? It was just a large language model with Wolfram Alpha connected and a Python prompt? Well, I don't think so. I think the brain, there's something elegantly beautiful about our own understanding of things and the brain itself that doesn't seem to look like a collection of different sort of bolted together bits and bobs. And if it was, then we would probably have a much deeper understanding of intelligence than we already do.
Yeah, exactly. And Melanie pointed out, the group of engineers and scientists in the 1954 Dartmouth summer workshop, they said that they would create AGI in that summer.
Yeah.
Right. And subsequently, in the intervening times, people have said, we'll create this AGI architecture and I have this component and this component. And there's a real anthropocentric bias here. First of all, that we see capabilities that don't exist in current models, and also this extrapolative fallacy that, it has these capabilities already, and if we add these additional modules and components, then, just look at the difference between monkeys and humans. That's what Connor said. So the inference is, if we add a few more modules and nodules into this language model, then could you imagine how far? Just extrapolate on, and the gradient is so steep that we can't risk doing this incrementally. Like, there's all of these little leaps that they make.
Yeah, and the leap, I think it's 3 times, isn't it? The difference between chimp brain and human brain, but then 3 times greater than a human brain, you get an African elephant. So, I mean, I'm sure there's arguments to be said. Larger brain size is more capable, that's for sure. But look at an octopus. I mean, that's amazingly intelligent in its own domain and its own understanding of the environment, which has a very small brain. I think sort of on the scale of, I think it's half the size of something like an ostrich brain, which is incredibly stupid. So we've got to sort of be very wary where we're interpolating and where we're definitely extrapolating.
Yeah.
And I go back to the previous example, which is, what does it look like for AGI to get to the moon? What does that mean? Do we mean that AGI has to, without any human involvement, build a rocket, understand how to get that rocket to the moon, move itself? What does that mean? There's it's very easy to talk very broadly about these ideas, but I think the detail is where the future lies. I always say that the future might be many, many things, but one thing we can be for sure that it's going to be is detailed. So we might as well talk about the detail and not spend too long on the broad stuff. Yeah, I think that the final result as well of this was that the con side swung slightly to the left, or as in like the con side slightly won, I think by about 3 or 4% of movement. But
although Tegmark would respond saying that the big result was that so many people already naively or not, depending how you look at it, thought that AGI was a risk.
Yeah, exactly. So it's hard to say who wins and loses. I think what's interesting is that it didn't move that much, and that
so that kind of shows the entrenchment.
Shows the entrenchment, but also shows that broad brush doesn't really get you very far, and that you need to convince people, you need to talk about details. Otherwise, the same high-level ideas will still be true at the end of the debate as they were at the start.
Because the weird thing, though, is that in this particular case, the layman already agrees with the pro side. But if it were the other way around, they would presumably make the argument that the layman was just incapable of understanding the risk.
Yeah, I suppose. I think again, it's very appealing, the argument at a high level, and I think most people will understand the principle that superintelligence is potentially bad in future if it can do things like self-replicate and reason. And we're hearing through the media that it can do these things, like it can reason, and that there's this new thing called ChatGPT that has all of this emergent capability. So it's not surprising to me that so many people are putting together pieces very sort of in a logical way, that if we've got a very intelligent system that can self-replicate, that is potentially bad. And I don't think it helped when LeCun says partway through this debate that intelligence is inherently good, and that it's again just playing straight into the hands of the opposition in this case to say that, because of course you can end up with intelligent people who want to do bad things, and so again that doesn't particularly sort of strengthen the argument, I think. But yeah, it's interesting to see so many people, their gut feeling about this seems to be extremely worried. But perhaps that just says something about us as a society, that we want to kind of fear the worst, and there's something quite sort of alluring about these doomsday scenarios that sort of gets people, really truly believing in them.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe you can just comment on that, just the incredible shift of the Overton window. Bad news travels faster, and there's something really sticky about this. I mean, it seems very orchestrated as well, but why do you think that is?
I think, first of all, it's a much easier position to take to be on the side of the X risk, because it's very hard to prove you wrong. The only way really to prove somebody like that wrong is to absolutely categorically prove that there's zero risk. which obviously you can't do. You can't prove the absence of something. There's even a section of the debate where they talk about a teapot between the orbits of Jupiter and Saturn, and the fact that it's very easy to prove something like that would exist, but how would you possibly disprove it? And it's the same thing here, really. It's the same idea that to say, yes, there is, of course, a potential for existential risk is very different from saying there is an existential risk and we need to pour a huge amount of time and money into solving it. I totally agree with what you said earlier, which is that it's a gradation from narrow AI, which is what we've got at the moment, to super intelligent AGI, and we're somewhere along that spectrum. Yeah. Certainly, GPT-4 pushes us more towards generalist zero-shot learning and few-shot learning, but that to make it a debate which is a completely black and white scenario as to whether something along this spectrum will be at some point in the future an existential risk is just so broad that it's almost impossible to prove the opposite. And so I think this is why you're seeing a lot of people coming out and saying, yep, because the counter argument is such a tiny kind of part of this whole idea space that they're positing the debate around, that it's you really have to have thought the arguments through to sort of come to the conclusion, as I would have done. I would have been on the con side, that under my grounds for what I consider to be existential risk, that I would argue more in favor of con than pro here, because I don't see it as particularly beneficial to see something as existential risk in the near term, and I also don't think that it's likely given the amount that we're missing.
And of course Tegmark would probably argue that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I just think we have to be really careful when talking about this, that we narrow down the field of the debate or the discussion to a particular mechanism. Firstly, I would recommend that. Secondly, I would say it's very important as well to put some form of time frame. And it's not about saying like, let's make this really tightly scoped to 3 years, but let's not go beyond 100 years, because I feel like, this is broadly what we're talking about here. We're talking about something that in our lifetimes is going to cause us huge harm. And then also just kind of, the idea that we can actually start to prove some of the ideas. This doesn't have to be a philosophical debate for long. We can build models that are trained on limited amounts of data up until a point in time and prove what they can do in terms of future knowledge. We can use problems like ARC as a basis for testing these models, and not just talk speculatively about super intelligence or smarter than us at the broadest level, but we can actually start to narrow down particular problems.
But we already know the answer to that. We know that ARC hasn't been solved, and we know that if we trained a language model on 1930s data and to see if it could discover relativity, I don't think they would argue that it could. I mean, obviously it can't. Yeah. I think they're arguing that, with a few modules, maybe it could in the future.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, you look at the experiments that were done ultimately to prove that, and it was things like measuring the eclipse and the position of Mercury behind the eclipse. And, these are all things that were carried out in the physical world. They weren't things that a large language model could have established for itself to be true. And this is where, just cycling back right to the beginning of the discussion, the idea of embodiment, or as I like to call it, just physical presence, is important. Doesn't mean a body in the traditional sense, but it certainly means being able to run experiments in the real world. And I don't think that's something that
getting feedback from the physical world,
right? Yeah, exactly. Feedback, is important, and it's not talked about enough, I think. And I would certainly be more scared, for example, if these AGI systems of the future were being put into highly advanced forms of robots where they were robust to physical changes, like knocking them over doesn't knock them out. They can, they have extremely long battery life, or they have the ability to kind of, to kind of, recharge themselves or whatever it might be in a way that's robust to, again, changes in the environment. But it feels like we're a long way off that, and that's not something we need to be imminently scared of in the slightest.
David Foster, it's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for Gogglebox MLST. Yeah,
this has been amazing. Yeah, if you folks like Gogglebox MLST, then we'll get David back and we'll do another one, because I've really enjoyed this. It's been amazing.
Thank you. Cheers.
Amazing. Cool.